safe and affordable housing. I think it was Donna that came up with our mission statement for that group, SAHA. So now you hear SIHA, SAHA, you know what I'm talking about. Health seemed to be an appropriate way to open conversations. People who in academia who study social science, people who are in health sciences, have access to a lot of literature that explains the relationship between the quality of our housing to our emotional health, our financial health, our social health. And we also felt that health was a commonly held value. So that's the way we framed it. And this diagram shows a motto and a logo that we created based on healthy housing. Simultaneous to that, those conversations were happening in 2017. And in 2017, there were more calls within the city and to the city to have a housing study, which finally, just this year, got funded. It is called a marketing study, but I received a solicitation to apply to be on a steering committee for that group, and I noticed that the way they were framing this discussion was instead, it was a little bit different. Instead of healthy housing, they said appropriate housing. Well, you can imagine, because you're all good conversationalists, how people can hash over a name. And I've learned from working with ICDD in public conversations that the way you name the topic has a huge difference in how people walk into the room and start conversing about it. That's a good thing, it's a natural thing, it's an inevitable thing. But it invites people to lay out what their values are and what they were thinking when they responded to that phrase. So I'm going to have us go through that first step that we did in the Seesaw project as we got people to converse about housing. If you were to look at some of the details, and I'll provide you with the copy of this because I know there's too much information on the slide, you'll notice that some of the same attributes of housing that Saha said it was concerned about were the same attributes or factors that the city invokes when they talk about appropriate housing. But despite that, there is a tension. So what's in a name? We can go to the next slide now. We began in our very first session of what we called study circles. A group of 14 residents of Manhattan volunteered after attending our first public forum in the Manhattan Public Library to dedicate time over the summer to explore the issue of housing, to study it, to examine alternatives, to examine what other communities were doing. And the very first conversational exercise we gave was asking them, what do you think of, what are the value terms that immediately come to mind when we say the word home? And maybe Katie can give some examples of what she heard when we addressed that.
Sure, this is live. Is it sounding okay? Mic is live? Great. Yeah, some of the things we heard when we asked people about home had to do with very personal perceptions. So a place with a yard, a place to be in nature. I remember one person, this is a quote, saying, "Not to be packed in like rats in a tiny space." Home evoked a lot of very personal ideas.
And I invite you to sort of store and share with us later on what occurred, what image came to your mind when we just say the word home. Now, housing. What images come into your head? What value terms come into your head? And Katie, what were some of the things that you recall people said in response to that inquiry?
Housing seemed to open people's minds to thinking beyond themselves. So not only their own experience of home, but are we providing what we need to others? That's what got people saying, wait a minute, there's folks who are unhoused in our community. How do we consider those people when we talk about housing? How do we think about students, military populations, very, very ephemeral sometimes, groups of people who need housing? What about elders who may be on a fixed income and their housing? What about young folks entering the workforce and their housing?
So you can hear the shift in focus that was taking place in people's minds when we threw those commonly used words to them. That's significant. That's already suggesting that there are dual value systems that we deal with when we open up this conversation. And essentially the language, as Katie pointed out, went from personal to public. There were very aspirational terms used in both, but essentially I would describe it as the difference between really affective language, emotional language on the home, and on the housing, more cerebral, cognitive, problem-solving language was being expressed. Let's add another word, home equity. Now, when does the term home equity come up in conversation? Or what picture do you have in your head, Katie, when I say home equity?
It's funny because when you said it the first time, I thought about equity in housing. But I know what you mean, and it comes up when you're refinancing your home, when you're thinking about buying a home and wondering if the investment is going to build something that you have in the future.
What a great plan. Home equity. I didn't know that phrase at all until I went for my first mortgage. I didn't know what it meant. A lot of young people don't know what it means. Some people say that young people need this lesson in high school so that they're more prepared for that finance. Everything going okay? Oh, thank you. I was relying on you to do that. Okay, now, housing equity. I want you to all ask yourselves, when does housing equity come up in conversation? What are the situations? How do you picture housing equity? Katie, just give a stab at it.
I picture housing equity meaning that everyone has a safe place to live, that they can afford, that is free of dangers, that suits them, that is accessible in the ways that they need. That's how I picture housing equity, regardless of income or standing, socioeconomic standing in a community, that everyone has access to their shelter needs. Again, I want you to all think about that and be ready to address it when we get into the more interactive part of this talk. But being the librarian I am, I had to Google it and note the huge difference in the number of results that I got of websites that used home paired with equity as a phrase and housing equity as a phrase. And here's a sample of what those pages look like that basically underscores the difference that Katie just pointed out. This is a site that I might have sought out when I was looking for my first home. I didn't know that equity was what you've paid down on your house until you've paid it all off. Once you've paid off your mortgage, you have 100% equity, and boy, you can do things with that. You can sell it, you can bequeath that property to your family or your friends. You can also use it to get more money. So naturally, the lending institutions, the real estate institutions, there are huge industries in the United States dedicated to explaining and helping us build wealth through the equity that we have in our homes and other property. No real surprise. I think a lot of people have heard that phrase. Now, housing equity, I've got two samples from that search, and one comes from Habitat for Humanity. And here, you're not talking about yourself as a consumer searching for a house in competition with other consumers that has everything that you want at the price you can afford, with the long-term objective of staying and also taking advantage of that wealth-building opportunity that it gives you. Instead, you're talking on the more collective level
about what we as a community think is fair, just, equitable in housing for everyone. And so we've made a shift from shelter to wealth, from the idea of my house and the equity and the wealth that I can build from that to the need all people have for shelter, and how in this big diverse society and in this market and economy we can even do that. There are a lot of researchers and policymakers that understand that housing equity has strong relationships to neighborhoods. We know it has relationships to schools. It has relationships to economic development and everyone's safety and security. Really important concept. Getting back to that tension between two value systems that we're all really quite familiar with. One that I would call equity among consumers for home equity, and one that I would call housing equity as privileging wealth. I'm sorry, did I just switch those? They're dual values, and they're individual, communitarian, and they're all very common. So when we have community conversations, all those values are going to be on the table, and there's going to be a tension between them. The question that I asked during the life of our Seesaw project, and what we were learning as we researched what other communities were doing, was how we can have it both ways. How we can find a common denominator, how we can create a hybrid of these two ideas. In other words, is it possible to give the opportunity, the accessibility of home ownership and the wealth privileges that obtains to people who are on the lower end of the economic spectrum, despite the fact that they're facing a competitive market, sometimes a hot market, like the one that we're in right now, where the hopes of investing seem to be very fragile indeed. During the life of our project, we learned of different models for handling this, and a Habitat for Humanity report in 2017 listed 4 on the spectrum, and it is a spectrum of housing solutions that focuses on home ownership. So while we were interested in non-home ownership models, I thought that this marriage of the dual values of equity building and ownership might have a compatible chance. And other communities are doing the same thing. 2 of them that I just want to mention here today, and one which we'll go into more detail, are cooperatives and community land trusts. Click. Oh, wow, we have dueling clickers. Here we go. All right. How many of you been, this is hands holding, how many of you been down Allen Road and are familiar with the 2 cooperatives that we have? Been around since 1968. These are called limited equity cooperatives. When you enter into them, you're not dealing with a down payment, you're not dealing with rent. You are becoming a shareholder. By purchasing a share in the cooperative, which was set up by a corporation, back in this case in the late 60s, you are allowed to live there as long as you want to and can pay for incidental maintenance fees and can keep up with your property. So there are renting cooperatives, but this is a limited equity opportunity. What does this do for home equity? Well, there is a sort of artificial schedule of equity building that you go into. And I'm going to show you an example from the Prairie Glen on the West End, Prairie Glen townhouses. When you enter in this case from 2020 is the latest schedule that they post on their website. You are paying the full value of the share or the unit that you're going to occupy, plus a move-in fee. But you have paid it. At that point, you're paying miscellaneous fees and you're paying your own energy bill. Now, when you decide to move on, you get that back. You get that full amount back, plus a schedule of equity building that was predetermined when the cooperative was created and which you signed an agreement to accept. Compared to taking the risk or the opportunity of investing in a home with a 30-year mortgage whose value could rise incredibly in a short period of time, even without improvements that you make, you are scheduled to earn equity and you get it all back when you sell your share to someone else because you're ready to move on. I knew about 4 families who lived in Prairie Grand townhouses as they were graduate students and for some years afterwards. And when I asked them, well, that's a huge down payment. I used the wrong word. That's a huge amount that you're paying up front. In the case of a 2-unit, it was over $7,000, 3-unit, $8,000 in 2020. That's a lot of money. You could go and get a loan for that, but the schedule is a modest, say, $156 a year increase in the value. Think about home equity as the building up of your wealth. I would have to say that while I'm not getting the same kind of equity out of that agreement as I would if I bought a house, what am I getting in return? I'm getting a well-managed, cooperatively managed, safe, secure place to live that is stable and that has neighborhood qualities that all 4 of these families pointed out to me. That there was such interest in remaining there that some were even asking other family members if they'd like to buy in so that they could have them nearby. So that's one model of shared equity, the limited equity cooperative. Here are some of the assumptions that have led to the development of these kinds of cooperatives. What does this do for housing equity? If housing equity is giving more people an opportunity to enter into the market, essentially with housing equity, we are offering yet another avenue for permanent residents in an area, and I want to mention a new issue here, where I work. Workforce housing, which is really defined as housing in alignment with your salaries or earnings and proximate to your work site, is enhanced by this kind of an option. So now I'm going to show you the second, and probably the one of great interest to you since I understand your congregation is looking at land trusts, the CLT. There's one in Lawrence, and they came in and offered us a seminar in how they structured their community land trust, which is called Tenants to Homeowners, or Lawrence Community Housing Trust. Sometimes those terms, housing and land trust, are used interchangeably, but I'll show you why you have to be careful about that. In this case, a nonprofit owns the land. They lease the land to the homeowner that purchases a home for far less than they would have to purchase if they were buying both together. The nonprofit is responsible for assuring that the next owner of that house is going to be income qualified, as was the original owner of that house. So the nonprofit that wants to steward affordability for low-income earners in perpetuity is in charge of the resale and is also in charge of managing that land. And this is a growing interest across the United States, especially since 2008. We were very interested, those of us working on the project, in the CLTID, And it also turned out that other groups in Manhattan were interested as well, including Habitat for Humanity, the Manhattan Area Habitat for Humanity. So essentially, what we want to understand about a CLT is that there's a difference between the market value, you see it here as $220,000, and what the homeowner gets to pay for it, the income-qualified homeowner. That's quite a significant difference. $133,300 is what they're paying. How do you make that sustainable? It's a subsidy. How is a nonprofit going to keep that going? One of the chief tools they have for that is to actually split the equity that has grown over the life of the homeownership. The homeowner isn't going to get to carry it all away with them into their next purchase. They'll take a smaller share. The nonprofit will take a larger share that gives them the wherewithal to offer that subsidy to the next homeowner. So they say the subsidy stays with the house, and the house stays with the land, and the land has been taken effectively off of the competitive marketplace. Imagine, if you will, a map of Manhattan with little spots, parcels listed as, oh, these are now part of a CLT, and the arrangements of that CLT are designed to keep that land and the houses on it affordable in perpetuity. Seems like kind of a novel idea, but it's been in existence in various permutations since the 1960s, roughly. There are a lot of assumptions behind this. I think that most people agree that, and some Nobel Prize winning economists have agreed and formalized, that wages on the aggregate will never keep up with the growth in investment property. It won't happen. It's not happening in San Francisco. It's not happening in Manhattan, Kansas. There are formulas that I can hardly read that describe this relationship. And yet, we have this idea that we could possibly exercise stewardship on the land itself in order to keep some spaces off of that hot market. But stewardship is not limited only to the community-held value of affordable housing. Stewardship, my first example of a land trust was when I was asked about the Kansas Land Trust holding land for the preservation of biodiversity in perpetuity. I think you probably have some members who are members of the Kansas Land Trust here. I know I came to a meeting here of them. You can also consider cultural preservation another community-held value that a stewardship is required in order to maintain. So those are two instances of community land trusts, three now, that are out there that are operational. It's not trivial to start one of these things. This is one model that starts with a piece of land that becomes available, but key to the process is getting widespread community support and the dedication of people in what's going to be essentially a nonprofit organization. Habitat for Humanity International has begun looking at this model in comparison with their traditional model of offering housing by building it and giving zero-interest loans to qualifying low-income families. They're looking at the sustainability of it. And our local Habitat chapter reached out to one in Maryland that said they would help usher us through the early processes, as they were once helped by another Habitat affiliate in Georgia. So we're looking at this possibility, and we hope that we can get more interested parties. We've talked to the county appraiser because we know there are implications for appraisal, there are implications to city, county governance, even to the school district. So this is a long-term project, but we hope that it will have an impact. And that was one of the outcomes, just one, of having community conversations on the Seesaw project for 2 years. I think at that point, it's time for us to have a more interactive Q&A, if I haven't spent up too much of my time.
I just turned the volume down, man.
Let's have our brief video, which is about community land trusts, to help explain the concept a little more. And then we will have time. We'll have about 10 minutes for question, answer, and discussion with Donna.
I'm not unique. And also, and the situation is it, but I also know that the results of
As a nation, we are not building enough homes and haven't done so for decades. We're building less than half the homes needed just to keep up with the new households forming each year. This means that in many parts of the country, house prices and private rents continue to soar. This is a big worry for people, some putting their lives on hold because they cannot afford high rents or a deposit to buy a home, or are suffering because of overcrowding or poor private rented conditions. In rural areas, families are being priced out and vital local services, such as shops, pubs and schools, are closing. Elsewhere, whole neighbourhoods are blighted by empty properties, disinvestment and failed regeneration initiatives. In response to this, people everywhere are coming together to develop local solutions. They are setting up CLTs. Community land trusts are local organisations set up and run by volunteers to develop and manage genuinely affordable homes based on what people actually earn, as well as pubs, shops, gardens or workspaces. And not just for now, but for every future occupier. This means that CLT residents will have enough money left to spend on living. And because the community is in the driving seat, they can build the housing they really want, including the design and allocations, and may even make use of the land before development. Here's how it works. First of all, the land is bought by or transferred to the CLT. They then build the homes or assets, either by commissioning builders, by working with a developer or housing association, or by doing it themselves. There are over 175 community land trusts in England and Wales, half of which formed in the last 2 years, and there is huge potential for many more. The National Community Land Trust Network is the charity for CLTs in England and Wales. Our goal is to see a CLT in every community. So how can you be part of the movement too? Get in touch and get involved.
I can see how the community land trust idea would be really nice for certain areas like the one I live in, especially where the way houses are turning over now is they're going to people who have less interest in the house. Either it's somebody who's going to rent it out, and then the renters then are paying all of their mortgage, so they're not really earning the equity in a sense. But anyway, the hard part to me seems like getting people to buy in on like how do you acquire the land. So there's not much incentive for somebody to give up the land under their house in the first place. But it'd be really hard for a CLT to, say, purchase outright new properties in a very expensive area. So I'm not sure how that's worked around.
The question is a big one. Where's the starting point in land acquisition? How do you get that the property becomes available? It's become available through a number of means. Sometimes land is donated by, well, this time I'm going to use another word for trust. If you look at the Riley County GIS and you're seeing who owns a particular parcel or plot, sometimes it's been passed down to a bunch of family members who don't live in the town anymore, and it's part of a family trust. Many of those people are open to the suggestion that they might receive a tax incentive for donating that land. That's one strategy. In Ithaca, the land trust up there started not from a let's build on a bare piece of ground, but let's restore a deteriorating piece of property. So they integrated preservation and rehab into the acquisition. And in places like Detroit, where there's abandoned property, these are fertile grounds for identifying potential new sites for rehabbed or new building. There are a lot of different ways to try to get that first site, and that's the first challenge.
Oh, thanks for speaking to us, Donna. And is that development on Anderson across from the Alumni Center, is that an example of a land trust for rich people? Because, you know, I'm talking about those condos, because someone just told me that they have to sell 60 of them before they'll start building, but they acquired all the houses that used to be there.
I'm not aware of what is going to be built. I have not heard anything of a land trust in that property. Has anyone else? Okay, so that is the question and the answer I asked, I put out to the congregation, does anyone know the basis of that construction? And one person said that it would be high-end, expensive condominiums. No known announcements about a nonprofit management entity, which is a requirement for a CLT.
I believe the foundation is spearheading that.
And the KSU Foundation is working on the development of that property, or owned in transition those bought-up houses on Anderson between 17th and Denison is the area we're talking about.
Thank you. I did ask someone at the foundation one time why the foundation is buying that and building it, and they said because it's going to make us money. So, but my question is that this whole thing is very new to me, so I'm not quite sure I understand it all. But is there a role for people that own a house in the community now to say they own it without a mortgage, to take part in this as to what they're going to do with their house?
Donation of land, bequeathing land, offering land to the nonprofit, which if it is spearheaded by Habitat for Humanity, would become part of their operation. That's one role, but there's also so many other roles that people can take. We need to have public education on what this model signifies. We need people not to have a knee-jerk NIMBYism, not in my neighborhood, because they don't understand that this is really home ownership. And we also need more conversations with people in a position to make modifications to our tax appraisal system. But we've already put those people in Riley County in touch with Douglas County to find out that it can be done.
So I still don't quite understand. Say I own my house
Yes.
without a mortgage, and if I donated it, would I get anything back on it, a partial value? You were talking about a certain amount is spent on these, but it's not the full amount, or...
Okay, I understand your confusion. You're wondering if a donor who's paid off their house and is willing to donate it to the nonprofit CLT, what kind of financial incentives there are for them. That's a tax question. I wish my husband Bill were here because he does tax advising, but that's a matter of the value of what you donate to any nonprofit and how that affects your taxes. So separate that question from the question of what will happen after the nonprofit receives your property free and clear of mortgages, and what they do then in the separation of land from property value ownership. Those are two separate steps. Once you donate your land free and clear to any nonprofit, it's up for them to do according to their mission with the value of your land that they choose to.
Okay, here's a follow-up to Ann Cowan's question. You keep speaking of donations of mortgage-free property. Why isn't there some thought about the community trust buying the land? Maybe, for example, if my home is worth $200,000, maybe I'd sell it to the land trust for $100,000. Is there, and well, let's just leave it at that.
Okay, the question, as I'm understanding it, is why couldn't a nonprofit purchase rather than wait for a donation? And I have to say that the long-standing community housing, Lawrence Community Housing Trust, over 2 decades now, has developed what you might call a portfolio of income streams. They include rental housing, so that they are taking affordable rental housing for income-qualified owners and turning that into revenue that gives them enough capital to go out and buy land. To tell you the truth, they are a developer. They are not as interested in rehabs as in purchasing land, building new houses, and they're essentially in competition for land with those who would be building it for market rate. So yes, that's feasible.
I'm curious about how properties like this can benefit student or short-term housing or short-term rentals. Because I'm a young person, not in a place where I could necessarily buy a house and say commit to being in one place for a long term. But how do properties like this help lower rent or make things affordable for students or short-term rentals?
That's why I put the 2 examples up side by side. A limited equity cooperative is very appropriate for people who are not sure how long they'll be in a community, not sure whether they want to make the financial commitment for their household on a 30-year mortgage, but do have the capacity of putting down enough money to have a place to live and a share in the cooperative. The CLT is more geared towards people who have made their commitment to settle in a place, though, quite honestly, after you meet those income qualifications, you can stay as long as you want. You are not told, oh, now you're no longer eligible for the CLT house which you own. No, and you're accruing, this is important, you're accruing value based upon the marketplace. So those houses in Lawrence, they are increasing in value. They are part of the free market system. It's at the sale that that profit gets split, gets shared between the nonprofit to enable subsequent residency by low-income qualified households, and a certain amount of that profit which will stay with that first owner.
Just had a quick comment from Anna Franklin online. She says, thanks to Donna, this is very relevant and important information for our time. a great talk and very useful for our congregation and our community. So,
Thank you, Anna.
Well, that's a great comment for us to conclude on, and I want to thank Donna for sharing the good work she's been doing in Manhattan area to help develop solutions to the scarcity of affordable and safe housing. And I hope for us it just opens a larger conversation as we're concerned with equity and compassion for our fellow humans. Renee Brown will now perform and sing hymn 57, All Beautiful, the March of Days. I invite you to hum along, and you're also welcome to stand if you need an energizing moment, or to stay seated. We'll hum along as Renee plays and sings.
All beautiful the march of days as seasons come and go. The hand that shaped the rose hath wrought the crystal of the snow, hath sent the hoary frost of heaven, the flowering waters sealed, inlaid a silent loveliness on hill and wood and field.
Our closing words today come from the Reverend Scott Taylor. It's flung. Joy doesn't simply arise, it flies, it flings. No, it's flung. It is passed, it is spread between you and me, between the one who just received a gift and the one that has been looking for it a long time. It's a beautiful and elegant contagion over which we have more control than we think, if only we share it. If only we notice that it's not ours to keep, but ours to pass on. So let's light up the world, friends. Joy blesses us with its exuberance, so we can make that blessing grow. Go in peace.